Nowadays, the word outbreak would largely be considered something that would refer to an outbreak of a disease or virus. However, back in the 19th century, Australia had to deal with a massive outbreak of a problem that was slightly different: rabbits. Rabbits aren't actually native to Australia and they don't occur there in the wild at all, naturally. However, in 1788, when the first European settlers travelled to Australia, they took with them captive rabbits to keep there. Despite these European settlers taking their rabbits with them even in 1788, there were no real problems until the 1800s. A wealthy landowner who moved to Australia in around the 1800s, named Thomas Austin, was actually credited with the outbreak of the rabbits. Thomas Austin was a big game hunter and he loved to hunt animals in his spare time as one of his hobbies, and so he decided to release 24 rabbits into Victoria in Australia for sports hunting. The aim was to recreate the hunting traditions he had in his native land of England. Rabbits are well known for breeding quickly, and so Thomas Austin believed that these rabbits would go on and have kits, which would then create their own population, which would feed him and other people living in Australia, as well as keeping them busy with sports. On top of this, it would also keep them busy and entertained with game hunting. Unfortunately, obviously the main problem with trying to recreate England's wildlife is it wasn't in England, it was Australia. And so, because the conditions were really different there, the rabbits also started to react and act differently, including how the population spread. Unlike in England, rabbits in Australia didn't actually have that many natural predators, and on top of that, they thrived in the Australian environment because they found very abundant food sources. Like I mentioned earlier, rabbits are well known for their breeding ability, and what's notable about rabbits is that they can produce thousands of baby rabbits in just a few years, and then obviously those thousands can go on to produce even more. By the turn of the 20th century, there were so many rabbits in Australia that the land itself was beginning to fail. There's a certain habit you can see when an animal overpopulates a land called overgrazing. What was happening here is the rabbits were overgrazing the land, which was leading to soil degradation, causing environmental destruction. Even someone with the most basic understanding of ecology would understand how important soil is to the life it sustains. Predatory animals will live off prey, but prey will have to eat plants, and plants have to grow in the soil, so it all goes back to the roots eventually. On top of completely destroying the habitat by overgrazing, rabbits outcompeted lots of native species that were living in that area, destroying the natural ecosystems that had been built over millions of years. Obviously, this eventually then affected farmland, which meant the Australian economy actually started to crash because of how many rabbits there were. The country was starting to fall apart because of how many rabbits had bred. Eventually, both the people and the government of Australia came to the conclusion that they needed to do something to control the rabbit populations before it was too late. Not only was it damaging to the economy and to individual people, but on top of that, it was destroying Australia's native wildlife. A lot of attempts were made to control the population, including putting up fences and using poisons. However, these were largely unsuccessful. But eventually, in one of the most dystopian human-animal interactions, a conclusion was finally made and a decision was put in place. Humans decided to use one outbreak to defeat another outbreak. In 1950, the myxoma virus was introduced. The myxoma virus is famously known for causing the unforgiving myxomatosis. This virus was introduced to the rabbits and then spread around the populations by the rabbits that were infected. Once the rabbits contracted the virus, they would experience myxomatosis. Rabbits that contracted myxomatosis would experience swelling in all areas. One of the most noticeable areas would have been the eyes. The eyes of rabbits that were infected would swell up, sometimes leaving them completely blind. The nose and genitals of the rabbits infected would also swell, and they would also have severe skin lesions that would be incredibly painful. In most of the areas where this horrific virus was released, 90 to 99% of the rabbits would be dead within a pretty short period of time. The rabbits would transmit the virus over to each other through direct contact, such as sex, but could also be transmitted through fleas and mosquitoes. During the more damp seasons where there was more water and therefore more mosquitoes, more and more rabbits fell sick with this virus. I think the worst thing about using this as a bioweapon against them is how long it took to kill them. It wouldn't have been an instant death. The rabbits had to undergo suffering before they passed away. The lesions and the swelling would have been incredibly painful for the rabbits, and like mentioned earlier, because their eyes would swell up, they wouldn't be able to see and they would go blind. An uncanny and upsetting sight that's quite common in rabbits with myxomatosis is seeing them distressed, hopping around in a circle because they're unable to move in a straight line with their now loss of vision. However, on the other side of the scale, it was overall good for the environment of Australia and the native wildlife there. The introduction of the myxomovirus greatly reduced the rabbit population in Australia, meaning the ecological damage could be prevented. One of my favourite things about evolution is that it always has a trick up its sleeve and you never really know when it's going to pull it out. But you do know that with enough time, the trick will come. And so eventually, rabbits started to build resistance to the myxomovirus. Some rabbits developed a genetic resistance to the virus. Because these rabbits didn't die or get incredibly sick with the virus, they then went on to reproduce and their offspring carried this genetic development with them. With the rabbits that were susceptible dying and the rabbits that were immune continuing to breed, populations eventually began to build herd immunities towards the myxovirus. This led to another surge in rabbit populations, and to this day, there are still rabbits in Australia that are still non-native and invasive species. The case of rabbits overtaking Australia's ecosystems and then being treated with a virus is definitely an interesting one to study. I think, from my perspective, one of the saddest things about this is how awfully unnecessary it all was. The entire thing seems to be based off of cruelty. The whole reason the rabbits were introduced in the first place was so somebody could hunt them down with a gun for fun, which is cruel. The rabbits then obviously weren't native to the environment and wiped out a bunch of native species, which again, cruel. And then lastly, as a way to try and prevent this problem, a virus was released which caused immense suffering amongst the rabbit populations. Again, pretty cruel, right? However, there are definitely lessons that we can learn from this so that we can prevent stuff like this happening in the future and hopefully progress and move forwards. One of the main takeaways from this is the importance of ecology and understanding a natural ecological balance. In the past, not too much attention was given to an understanding of ecology and the environmental sciences, especially with regards to biological communities. The idea that the English wildlife was superior to everything else and so it should just be introduced to replicate the English experience is what created the issue that Australians are now facing, unfortunately. However, when we begin to learn and understand about ecosystems and biodiversity and how important genetic differences is for specific areas, we begin to understand not just more about the world, but how we can live in it in a peaceful and helpful way. I think one of the main takeaways is how important education is here. This could have all been avoided if they just knew not to introduce a species that bred rapidly in an area where there were no natural predators and there was an abundant food source. This all could have been avoided. So the best advice is probably be kind to animals and go pick up a book. Oh, and if you have a pet rabbit, consider getting it neutered.